Daoism. What is the problem that Daoism sees, and what is the solution?
Well, the problem is lifelessness. The problem is that when we live in society, and in this case, this is a Chinese religion, there's the early Taoists are thinking about Confucian society, we get constrained by all this learning, by all this etiquette, by all these rituals, to live a life that's sort of dictated by other people. And what we need to do is to live a life that's natural, that's spontaneous, and that's free. And that is to say, a way of flourishing, which was what I call Daoism. So the problem is lifelessness that's pushed onto us by social conventions. And the goal then is a life that is well-lived and that flourishes and may, according to some Taoists, even give us a kind of physical immortality.
And the idea of human flourishing, living life to the full, sounds wonderful to people of just about any culture or geographical location in the world, I would think.
Well, and I think it's especially attractive to people who are living in a society that is fairly stable, where they're not worried about anarchy, right? And I think this is why Taoism became so popular in the West in the 60s and the 70s, kind of emerging out of the period of the 50s. This was a text that all kinds of hippies and all kinds of beats were reading, the text of the Tao Te Ching, this sort of classic scripture of Taoism, which was saying, hey, don't be, weighed down by, the man, and don't be the guy in the gray flannel suit, right? Be the person wandering out in the mountains, living your own life, not paying attention to social conventions, finding your own way, finding your freedom, finding your bliss. This is a very attractive idea to people who are, don't want to be caught up in the hamster wheel of their office life.
And another appeal that it would seem to make in today's world is that it says we should be living in harmony with nature, that we need to return to nature. An environmentalist would love that.
Yeah, there's a lot of resources for environmentalism in Taoism. The founder of Taoism, Lao-Tzu, has this moment where he is sort of stuck in this bureaucratic China, and he doesn't want to have this dead-end job of pushing papers around in a desk. And he decides that he's just going to leave. He's going to leave not only his job and his life in China, but he's going to leave China. He's going to go out into the barbarian lands of the mountains. And he goes wandering off, and just as he gets to the border, this border guard who knew of his reputation as a sage said to him, "Oh my gosh, you're leaving, don't leave without telling us what you know, leave your wisdom with us." And he writes, sort of on the equivalent of the back of a napkin, he writes the Tao Te Ching, and then he wanders off into the mountains, and we never hear from him again. There's no report back. He's just out there in nature. And there's a very strong tradition now in Taoism of the sacred mountains of China and going up and hiking the mountains and Taoist temples on the mountains, and it's out in nature among, the trees and the wind that we really find most fundamentally who we are and where we can most flourish as human beings.
But with Lao-Tzu, who's considered the founder of Taoism, there's some question about whether he actually lived or not, isn't there?
Yeah, we don't know. He may be a mythical founder. He's, what we know about Lao-Tzu is he's the guy behind the text. And, was there one guy behind the text? Were there multiple people behind the text? We're not really sure about that.
And this text, it doesn't have, creeds in it, as I understand it, because you say that Taoism is kind of allergic to doctrine. But it asks, what is the way?
Yeah, it's really interested in, one thing that's fascinating about it is it doesn't have any historical context. One distinctive of Christian and Jewish scripture is it makes connections with, in the time of Herod, right? In a particular historical moment, this thing happened. And the Tao Te Ching just kind of floats around, in sort of ahistorical time. And yes, one of the core concepts there is the Tao, the Tao Te Ching.
Which means what?
Well, the Tao means It's debated, of course, because it's the key word. But it means the way. It means the path. Mm-hmm. And the question then becomes, what is the path, and the path to what, and the path from what? And so it has a notion of both the origin, right? In other words, where the path started, and then also the end, sort of where the path goes. And so a big notion in Taoism is to figure out, what is the Tao, what is the natural way, we might say, for a human being, and then to get on that and to walk it. And one metaphor that you get for what the Tao is it's kind of like water. It's kind of like water going downhill, that water doesn't sit there and think and say, gee, I should go to the right here, or gee, my mother would like me more if I went to the left, or gee, I was taught in school that I should go straight. It just kind of goes by nature where it's going to go. And the Tao is thought to be something like that, and we should imitate both water and the Tao in that regard.
And we have to find out where our nature is going to lead us, so to speak.
Well, that's right, and we need to and not even less than find out. We need to just do it. There is this idea of intuition and spontaneity that the Tao is like that, and we need to just make decisions in the moment without too much reflection.
There are also the concepts of Yin and Yang that are connected with Taoism. Can you talk about those for a second?
Yeah, this is a place where, Yin and Yang is really more Chinese philosophy, Chinese religion. We find it in Confucianism. We find it in Daoism. We find it in Chinese popular religion. The basic concept, I think, is understood to many people in the West because it's been popularized in the West, that we have this more feminine principle of the Yin, and we have this more masculine principle of the Yang. And what's wrong with humans is we get out of balance. So it isn't that we want to be all Yin, it isn't that we want to be all Yang, but we want to have some combination of the soft and the hard, the sunny and the shady, the male and the female. And one way of understanding Taoism is as an effort to bring balance to China, because Confucianism was too much to the male, to the yang side of things, and to have this more spontaneous, soft. One example is the martial arts, right? The yang kind of martial art is karate, right?
Right.
It's like sharp pounding, macho, right? And the yin is more like aikido or
Tai Chi.
Exactly, Tai Chi. Thank you. Where you have these sort of soft, fluid kind of movements rather than these sort of sharp, staccato kind of movements.
You also mentioned, and I found this fascinating, that there's some relation between the Falun Gong and Taoism. And the Falun Gong, of course, was this very popular movement where Chinese would come out in public and do what looked to us like exercises. And it was banned by the Chinese government. What was the relation here?
Well, yeah, there are Taoist ideas in the Falun Gong and also practices. And I think part of what's going on is the Chinese government wants to have control over ideology, and religion. And so it wants to kind of know what's going on. And it was aware. I mean, throughout Chinese history, there have been movements by Taoists because Taoism has a kind of anarchic streak to it. Because of its emphasis on individual flourishing, individual freedom, and because of its mistrust. I mean, it's the kind of classic question authority sort of religion. It's not really very friendly to regimes, although there have been Chinese regimes that have tried to be Taoist rather than Confucian. It's really been more Confucianism rather than Taoism that's been running things. And the Chinese are nervous about that. And they're starting to inject Confucianism into their official ideology, but they have not gone the step of having Taoism be something that they think that
Confucianism, of course, values order. So,
Confucianism is much more about tradition, learning, social order, how to keep a society running through etiquette and ritual, and it's precisely etiquette and ritual that the Taoists are rebelling against, and even learning, which is another key Confucian value. I mean, so much of Taoism is about saying, look, Confucians think you become human by learning. We think we're born human, and it's learning that dehumanizes us. We need to stop learning. In fact, there's some Taoist stories that are sort of brags about how I've unlearned all the things that I thought I was supposed to have learned. It actually reminds me a little bit of anti-intellectualism in American life, where people will brag, especially like evangelical preachers, like, I never learned anything. All I know is, Christ and Him crucified. There's a little bit of that in the Taoist tradition too.
And the techniques that they recommend for finding the way are absolutely fascinating to me, at least in their diversity. If I could just quote a couple things from your book, they include sitting and forgetting, fasting of the mind, free and easy wandering, dietary regimens, breath control, visualization exercises, purification rites, sexual practices, meditation techniques, and various physical exercises modeled after the movements of long-lived animals like bear strides and bird stretches. Now, there is a set of techniques.
Yeah, it's very, very pragmatic in the sense of, whatever's going to work to keep you, to have a life that is vital, to have a life that is long, and a life that might even take you to immortality. I mean, they do have these ideas. Some of these Taoists, classically, the Taoist immortals, as they were called, would go on these crazy special diets where they would gradually get their diets to be more and more yang, more and more light. And they'd head toward rice, and then they'd head finally towards pine needles and pine nuts, because the pine needles are evergreens, right? So they have that sort of immortality about them. And then, according to the stories, they would start to float and even be able to fly, because they weren't being weighed down by this sort of heavy kinds of foods that other people were eating. And on the sexual side, you have this really interesting idea of the idea of qi, which we haven't talked about yet, which is really important in Chinese culture. This idea of energy that courses through us and courses through all of life, and that if you had sex and you would have an orgasm, you would be getting rid of your qi. And that wasn't good. And so the sexual practice was to sort of conserve your bodily, fluids in all kinds of ways, and that would somehow give you this, greater and greater vitality.
And
but
that's
I do have to say that I have to say that the practice that I love the most is the free and easy wandering, and the Chuang-Tzu text, the sort of second most famous text in ancient philosophical Daoism, is all about wandering. And just the virtues of wandering and the freedom of wandering and the naturalness and spontaneity of wandering. And I find that quite lovely in that particular document.
Is that sexual practice widely accepted that you described?
Well, I think it's understood that advanced practitioners of Taoism are able to have sex without having orgasms, and that is pretty common, yes. But ordinary people are ordinary people, and we aren't all immortals, and we aren't all sages. I think that's the way it goes in Taoism.
Now, there are gods in Taoism. In fact, you say there's a pantheon of them. It includes the Jade Emperor, the Queen Mother of the West, the 8 Immortals. Do you want to briefly describe the gods of Taoism?
Oh, gosh, I don't know if I can do that. I mean, I think, I guess what I'll say is that I find sort of parallels between some of the Taoist gods, or the immortals as they're called, and, say, the Catholic saints or the Yoruba Orishas, where you have a connection that's made between a particular immortal and a particular group of people. So, Old Man Jiang, for example, who's one of the 8 immortals, is sort of the elderly people love him, or Lu Dongbin, the barbers love him, or the philosopher Han, the musicians love him. So there's a sort of connection that's made between particular immortals and particular social groups. Another thing I'll say is that the pantheon has goddesses, and so in this sense, it's not a purely patriarchal tradition. It has some connections in this regard with Hinduism, which has the idea of the Mahadevi, the great goddess. Here we have the Queen Mother of the West, who sort of embodies the mysterious feminine, the yin that's so prized among Taoists. And what else do I want to say? Oh, the other thing is that in Taoism, as Taoism develops over time, it becomes not just seeking human flourishing and vitality and long life, but actually seeking immortality. physically living in your body forever. And the stories that are associated with these divinities is that they have achieved that. And they have achieved not only immortality, but also amazing capacities of supernatural capacities. Like one of them is able to make cities disappear and materialize at will. So sort of just click her fingers and there goes L.A., right? And then click it again and there L.A. comes back.
Very interesting.
I think that's pretty fabulous.
So insofar as there's a conception of an afterlife, it's that, living in your own body forever.
Right. There really isn't an afterlife. I mean, the goal is physical immortality. It's a little bit more like, say, the Greek notion of the immortality of the soul, where you just continue on, but in the case of the Greeks, it's disembodied, and in this case, it's embodied.
And finally, how would you describe the influence of Taoism in the world? And of course, this is particularly influential in China, I know.
Yeah, I think Taoism, of course, is influential in China. I think many and perhaps most Chinese are some combination of Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian. So it's not as influential in China as Confucianism, because Confucianism has been more successful in connecting itself with the state over the millennia in China. And Taoism has been the sort of outlier and the anarchic kind of tradition. But Taoism has been more influential in the West in the modern period, in the 20th century. And the Tao Te Ching is the most translated scripture in the West, in America, and Europe after the Bible. And so it's been widely read, widely commented on, and has been very influential, particularly, as you mentioned earlier, in the environmentalist movement, where Taoism is seen as very much nature-friendly, and then influential in the counterculture, where there was shared this idea that human life becomes lifeless when you are a cog in a machine, and it becomes full and flourishing when you follow your own nature, particularly out in the midst of nature, when you wander through the woods, when you act spontaneously and in the moment rather than through some calculation, and when you sort of unlearn the things that you've learned in order to get back to your true and more enduring self.
So it's had certainly its own set of influences. Stephen Prothero is a professor of religion at Boston University and the author of God is Not One, The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.